morning. Like she said, I am Jared. If you're new with us, welcome. Grateful that you're here. We are in a series in this book of Nehemiah. It's an Old Testament book, about 13 chapters. We're taking about 13 weeks to go through it. Did you get a study guide? Does everybody in the room, do you have study guides? If you don't, if you missed a study guide, Larry is in the back here. There's a table in the back, a couple of tables that have them. Raise up your hand and Larry will bring you a pen, bring you a study guide. It'll give you some background information on the book of Nehemiah, kind of the setting, the scope, what's happening there. It'll really be helpful to just orient you to this storyline and what is happening. Nehemiah is an ancient book that still speaks to us today. It was written about 2,600 years ago, but it has very, very relevant meaning for you and I today. This book reveals, in many ways and more, primarily how God works among his people. If you're kind of coming in and you need some orientation to the background, the chronology, where Nehemiah kind of fits in the Bible, in biblical theology, Nehemiah's events occur in the year 446 or around the year 446 BC, which is 440 years before Jesus Christ's birth. And it's about 50 years before the prophets in the Old Testament go completely silent. So where Nehemiah is, even though it's not where it is in your physical Bible, where it is in the chronology of Old Testament history is at the very end of Old Testament history. Nehemiah will come into the city, will help to secure the city of Jerusalem. The prophets are still speaking, Zechariah and some others at the time of Nehemiah, and then they're going to go quiet. And then for 400 years, there's going to be a period of silence until John the Baptist starts speaking again, the last Old Testament prophet, saying, prepare the way of the Lord. And he prepares a way for this Messiah to come and for God to come through on his promises. A little bit of orientation, especially if you're new to Christianity, you're new to the Bible. The Bible tells the story of God and his creation and how he creates humanity and how he creates a garden paradise for man and woman to live in harmony with him, unbroken fellowship, but also with one another. But before creation, one of God's created angels, Lucifer, went to war, wanted what God had, wanted the throne of God, wanted the power and the majesty and the authority of God, went to war against God. God defeated him, threw him down out of the heavenly realm, and Satan's domain became creation and became earth. He was thrown down with a third of the angels who were in heaven, these are demonic spirits, demonic angels. And God, for reasons that we don't fully understand and scratch our heads at, he gave Satan, this ancient serpent, Lucifer, he gave him dominion over the world and the realm that we live within. And this serpent slithered into the garden with Adam and Eve and began to speak to them in a voice that was contrary to God's voice and began to tempt them to follow his voice rather than the voice of their creator and rather than the voice of their Lord. And they listened to him and they followed him and they turned their backs on their creator. And as a result, they broke fellowship with God. They had been warned what this would look like. It would introduce death, and it also broke apart their relationship and the way that they could even relate to one another. It introduced all kinds of death and destruction and dysfunction into the cosmos. God had warned them that if they did this, they would not only die physically, but they would die spiritually, and they no longer had unbroken access to God's presence. You can't be in the presence of a holy God as a sinful person without that sin being atoned for. And so God exiled them from this garden paradise that he had created. And as they walked to the east, he left them with a promise. He left Adam and Eve, our first parents. He left them with the promise that he would provide through their lineage a Messiah. He would put it all back together again. He would restore all things in time. And he would do that through this lineage of the woman, a Messiah who would come out of her and Adam and Eve's descendants. And years later, as the biblical storyline progresses, he calls a man Abraham, and he gives Abraham a promise that his lineage, Abraham was from the lineage of Adam and Eve, that God would make Abraham into a multitude of people, and that he would bless the nations through this Messiah and this son of promise that would come through Abraham. And he delivered on that promise miraculously through Abraham, and then again miraculously through Abraham's son Isaac, a son named Jacob, who God renamed Israel. And Israel became a great nation. This man had a family, and this family became tribes, and these tribes became a massive nation. And as God continued to come through on his promises over time, he would give his people prophets. And God gave the prophet Moses to this nation of Israel. And God gave Moses a law that would govern how they would worship and how they would relate to one another, and their civil laws, and how God would relate to them through a sacrificial system and through a blood atonement. And he gave Moses a pattern for their worship, but he also gave them a place for their worship, a place where God would mediate his presence to them in a tabernacle. They were a nomadic people, and so this was a mobile tent, a mobile temple that would move with them as they moved throughout the ancient Near East, in the desert and Sinai. And eventually, generations after Moses, God would raise up a king for his people, a man named David. He would put it in David's heart to build him a permanent temple in the city of God, the city of Jerusalem. And David would not be the one to actually build this permanent temple, but it would be his son who built this permanent temple, a man named Solomon. And throughout the story of the Bible, you'll recognize, particularly in the Old Testament, that people are consistently wandering away from God, and God is calling them back, and they're turning their backs on him, and he's calling them back. It's the pattern of Adam and Eve that just continues to perpetuate itself throughout the world, bringing all kinds of disorder and dysfunction and brokenness. And at the time of Nehemiah, about 200 years before Nehemiah, now we're in about 586 BC, God had been warning Israel for about 200 years, stop worshiping the gods of the nations around you. Stop assimilating yourself into their culture. You are to be distinct. You are to be my people. But they would not listen to him. They refused him, and he warned them, and he warned them, and he warned them, and he warned them. And he was good to them and gracious and generous to them, but they kept turning their backs and doing whatever was right in their own eyes. And so eventually God brought judgment on this nation of Israel after a lot of warnings over two centuries. And he brought judgment through this northern kingdom, the kingdom of Babylon. This is world history. Babylon swept into Jerusalem in 586 BC, destroyed the city, destroyed the people, destroyed the temple and their worship, broke down the walls, left them in open shame, murdered tens of thousands of people, carried off tens of thousands more to serve the Babylon kingdom as slaves. A handful of years after this conquest of Israel, the Persians came in and conquered Babylon and essentially inherited the Israelite slaves. And the Persians had a kind of a different system of conquest. They were more benevolent in allowing their slaves and these nations and people groups that they had conquered to exercise their religion and to exercise their national identity and and to keep their ethnic identity. And so this king, Cyrus the Great, you can read about this in 2 Chronicles, at the end of 2 Chronicles, he allowed these Jews who are in this province, he allowed them all to travel 850 miles in waves, tens of thousands of people, back into Jerusalem to begin to rebuild the city and to rebuild the temple. You can read about this in the books in your Old Testament, Ezra and Esther. And they were led by Ezra, and they were led by a guy named Zerubbabel, and they were able to build the temple back up, but they had enemies in the surrounding provinces who opposed them. And a new king in Persia rose to power, a guy named Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes listened to the enemies of the Jews in Jerusalem who were around them in the provinces, and he put a halt to this work, and it stopped everything. The temple is built, but the city lays in open trouble and shame. And that's where we find ourselves in Nehemiah. That's some Old Testament history to kind of orient ourselves. Where is this all happening? How is this all occurring? What has taken place? Nehemiah was an Israelite captive. He was born likely into captivity. It's around the year 446 BC at this time. And God had elevated Nehemiah as a Hebrew, as an Israelite or a Jew. He had elevated him to this prominent status. He was what is called the cupbearer to the king, to King Artaxerxes. And Nehemiah, what that means is that he would taste all of the wine and all of the drink and anything that would come before the king. He would taste it with his own mouth and his own body, and he would essentially figure out if there was an assassination plot against the king with his own life. He was a line of defense, like our Secret Service agents are to our president. He was that to King Artaxerxes. He cared about Jerusalem. He cared about the worship of his fathers. He cared about the temple. He cared about the promises of God moving forward. And so a traveling band comes into Susa, where Nehemiah is serving the king of Persia. And he asks them about Jerusalem. They had just come from Jerusalem. And the news that he gets is disheartening to him. The city lies in ruin. The people are living in open trouble and shame, and it breaks Nehemiah's heart. And he begins a period of 4 or 5 months of just fasting and praying and asking God for opportunity. He knows Yahweh. He knows the God of all creation. He also has direct, good access to the most powerful man in the entire known world in the ancient Near East, Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. After about 4.5 months of Nehemiah's praying and fasting and pleading and mourning, he finds himself with an opportunity to ask Artaxerxes if he can personally involve himself, if he can get back and if he can go to Jerusalem, and if the king would reverse his prior decree to stop the work in Jerusalem, but actually let Nehemiah go. And we find that the hand of God was heavily upon Nehemiah for good. And the king reverses the decree from 20 years ago, says, Nehemiah, go. And not only go, but Nehemiah asks him for money and resources and timber and construction materials. And the king sends an armed guard with him, and Nehemiah travels for over 2 months back to Jerusalem, and he comes into the city of Jerusalem, and he inspects the walls, and he's a project manager, he's a general contractor at this point, and he's thinking about how he is going to secure these walls. He does some kind of by night, like covert assessment of the city, and then he comes and he calls together the officials of Jerusalem and the leading citizens of Jerusalem, and he says, you guys have got a plan. The hand of our God is upon us. The time is now. Let's rebuild the walls. And in Nehemiah chapter 2, the people say, let us rise up and build. And so he has the unity of the people. And last week, what we saw that the people organized and they cooperated with one another. And we saw that they were committed to the work. And we just read name after name after name in Nehemiah chapter 3 in this list. And so today, what we are going to see that these ancient Israelites, they faced opposition from God's enemies and from their enemies. We're going to see that these enemies around the people of God in Nehemiah's day are still lurking, and they're still plotting, and there's a great enemy behind them even who still opposes God, who opposes his people, and who opposes his work. And so for us, as we read Nehemiah chapter 4, as Meredith read that for us this morning, we've got to understand that there is an enemy behind our human adversaries. There's an enemy behind the scenes opposing the church. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 and 12 they remind us that our struggle is not against what? It's not against flesh and blood, but against what? Against the spiritual forces of darkness and evil. The same old serpent is still stirring up opposition. He's still jeering. He's still slandering. He's still seeking to destroy God's work. He hates God. He hated God. He hated the people of God in Nehemiah's day. He hates the people of God in our day, the church of Jesus Christ. So even when people oppose us, even when circumstances destabilize us, we've got to recognize that at times there is an agent behind the scenes exploiting and opposing God's work in our day. And so we're going to see today how these ancient Israelites, how they faced satanic ridicule and how they faced satanic opposition. And we're going to learn some things for ourselves. We're going to learn how to face crisis ourselves through their example. We're going to see how we can face crisis with prayer, with prudent action, and with intentional worship. That's how you and I face crisis. Whatever it looks like in our day, whether we're aiming to serve the kingdom of God with our lives or whether we just find ourselves in some crisis, maybe by our hand or somebody else's hand, here is how we face crisis: with prayer, with prudent action. Prudence means an eye to the future. Wisdom, wise action with an eye to the future. Prayer, prudent action, and intentional worship. Let's get into it. Nehemiah chapter 4 is pregnant with prayer and prudent action. It's all over this chapter, and it really comes into view right away. Real quick, back in chapter 2, we were introduced to these enemies of Nehemiah and the people. It was a guy named Sanballat. He was a governor of a nearby city to the north. And when he saw, in chapter 2, when he saw Nehemiah coming in to seek the good of the city, the good of the people, the well-being of the people, he was displeased. That's the language that Nehemiah gave us in chapter 2. Now he comes and he looks again, and now that he sees the work, he's enraged. He's filled with rage. Why? Geography actually gives us the answer to this. Because Jerusalem sat directly in the middle of a lucrative north-south trade route. And for 150 years, 140 years, Jerusalem has been completely destroyed, and all of the commerce and all of the trade that was flowing through that city has now been dispersed into the cities around it, bringing those cities wealth and acclaim, bringing them comfort, bringing them people, bringing them notoriety. Sanballat was a Horonite from Beth Horon, about 12 miles north of Jerusalem, in Samaria. One commentator, he says it like this. He says, to put it bluntly, a powerful Jerusalem means a depressed Samaria. With Jerusalem once more a well-protected city, its location is going to attract trade, and so gone will be the days of Samaria's economic supremacy in this land beyond the river. They were threatened by a rebuilt Jerusalem because it would rob them of the commerce and the economic supremacy that they were enjoying. And so Sanballat, he comes and he sees that the Jewish people are having success with the rebuilding of this wall, and he jeers at them. He jeers at those who are rebuilding the city walls. Notice in verse 2 that he does it also in the presence of an army of Samaria. These aren't villagers with pitchforks. It's kind of how we might imagine them. These are well-organized, well-established people in cities with standing armies. And Sanballat says this in the presence of the army of Samaria. What are these feeble Jews doing? They're going to restore this city for themselves? They're going to sacrifice to their God, and he's going to miraculously show up and help them rebuild it in a day? We're going to attack them, so they better get it done in a day. Are they going to revive the stones, these burned out trash stones? They're going to revive them and build it with those, or build it with new stones? Look at verse 3. Sanballat's buddy Tobiah, he is from Ammon to the east. He rolls in and he joins into the mocking, and he adds his own cutting joke. Yeah, if a fox jumps up on that wall, it's going to crumble. Foxes are known for being fleet-footed, light-footed. They can practically walk on snow. And so it's just another cutting joke at the expense of the Jewish people. The Hebrew word for jeering, it's a word that means scorn, and it's a word that means derision. It's got no redemptive value whatsoever in the Bible. Jeering typically doesn't attack ideas, but jeering actually attacks people who are made in God's image. And jeering seeks to make people subhuman. It's a posture that has no redemptive value. There's not a single place in the Bible where this Hebrew word is used for good or redemptively. It's the kind of mockery that acknowledges no value in your opponents. Whether you're or someone else is aiming to destroy somebody's reputation or robbing them of human dignity, to jeer is always evil, and it has no place among the people of God. It doesn't have a place in how we interact in our face-to-face relationships, in our digital relationships and our online relationships, jeering has no place among the people of God. It's not sinful to oppose something or someone, it's sinful to jeer them. I was thinking about this. Take inventory of our own public discourse in our day. We all feel it. We all know it's not a surprise. Like, we're very divided people as a nation. The political sides are lobbing bombs. There's not a lot of handshakes. There's a lot of balled up fists between our parties, within our political system. But think for a moment about the pundits that are in your news feeds, whether you're more to the left or more to the right, more centered. Think about the pundits. How much jeering is there on the news that you're consuming? Satan is the father of jeers. He's the father of jeering. Satan, this old serpent, this Lucifer who is thrown down, who wars against God through people, through means, seeks to oppose and tear down anything that God is doing, to tear down the image of God in people. He is the accuser of the church. It's one of the titles for this serpent, is the accuser. From the beginning, he ridicules God. He ridicules God's people. He ridicules God's plans. One of the easiest ways to oppose something or to oppose someone is to ridicule them, is to jeer them. Because what we do, or what we seek to do, is make what they're doing sound ridiculous. You know this. If you can make the person sound ridiculous, who cares about their ideas? Of course their ideas are ridiculous because they came from a ridiculous person. So why would I follow a ridiculous idea? Let's go to the level of personal attack. Let's take that person out and we can take their ideas with them. And that is exactly what Sanballat and Tobiah are doing. They're misrepresenting these Jews' effort. They're making what they're doing sound completely ridiculous. Did anyone say that they were trying to rebuild the wall in a day? That wasn't part of the equation. Nobody's trying to actually do that. What are these feeble Jews doing? Sanballat and Tobiah and these others with them, they attacked their personhood. They attacked their ethnicity. This is what racism does as well. It attacks a person at the level of their ethnicity and ridicules their ability to bring anything of value based on how much melanin is in their skin. It's evil. And what is also simultaneously true among the Jewish people at this time in Jerusalem is that they were feeble. They weren't feeble because of their ethnicity. They were feeble because of their circumstances and their place in life and in history. They had no resources. They had no help. They didn't have friends around them in the surrounding provinces. They were living in open trouble and shame. They were unable to complete the wall. They were unable to defend themselves. One commentator says, the reason that people ridicule those they oppose, aside from it being so easy, is that it is demoralizing. And it's frequently effective. So what's Nehemiah's response? What does Nehemiah do with all this derision and this jeering and this scorn? Look at verses 4 and 5. He doesn't try to explain. He doesn't try to defend himself. He doesn't argue his intentions. He doesn't whine to his buddies. He doesn't jeer. He doesn't trade insults back. He doesn't threaten them. He doesn't even answer them. He actually turns their taunts into his own prayers. Nehemiah calls on God to defend them. He knows his helplessness. He knows the danger of the situation. He is under immense pressure. He knows he doesn't have what it takes. He immediately turns and calls to God to defend them. Hear, O our God. We are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads. Plunder them in the land of their captivity. Take what they mean for evil. This serpent who is even behind them, take what he means for evil, turn it back on them. Nehemiah in chapter 1 has already confessed his own sin. He's confessed the people of Israel's sin. He's sought the mercy of God. He's understood that they've been outside of the will of God. He's sought to come close. He has sought repentance. And yet these enemies of the Jews and of Jerusalem and of Nehemiah's efforts. They do not want the well-being of God's people. They do not want the plan of God to continue. Nehemiah, in this prayer, he's also admitting he's hurt, he's angry, he's anxious, he's helpless. And I think this prayer can shock our leave it to beaver kind of evangelical sensibilities. He's not asking for mercy, he's asking for judgment. That's exactly what Nehemiah is praying for and asking for here. I appreciate it. He's at a time in redemptive history before Christ has given us a model on how to love our enemies. And so this prayer of Nehemiah goes with the imprecatory prayers in the Psalms, where the psalmist is crying out for judgment on the enemies of God who have no intent of returning to their Maker in repentance. These people are doing the work of Satan, and they're willfully trying to divide God's people. At best, they're ignorant, but at worst, they're malicious and they're violent. And Nehemiah knows that God is righteous, and he knows God's character, and he knows that he is just. And so Nehemiah, in his humanity, he can take inventory, he can judge the fruit, judge the situation, but still know that if he's wrong, calling out for God to judge them, that God will do what is right. God will do what is just, because God is righteous and God is just. But if these clowns keep up their tricks, they deserve judgment. So God, do your thing. Protect us. Don't overlook their evil. They're opposing your work. Bring judgment. He knew the work in Jerusalem was God's work, and therefore he was able to put it all back into God's hands. And he didn't retaliate. Instead, Nehemiah gave his burden to his God through his prayer. Nehemiah gave his burden to his God through his prayer. What happens when you and I give our burdens to God through our prayers? It diffuses, oftentimes, our burdens. The anger that we're carrying, as Nehemiah gave his anger to God through his prayer, has a diffusing effect. What happens when we give our fear? What happens when we give our hurt? What happens when we give our helplessness and our anxiousness to God, when we give these burdens to God? The same thing that happened to Nehemiah. Prayer diffuses our heavy burdens. Prayer oftentimes restores our perspective, renews our hope. Prayer diffused his anger, then what? Prayer also does something else. It increases our strength and it fuels God-honoring action in us. No matter the circumstances. Look at verse 6. So we built the wall. I love this. The enemies are opposing them, and Nehemiah prays to our God for defense, and he says, bring judgment on them, so we built the wall. His focus is solidified in this moment, and God gave them success as they trusted him with their future and their fate and the people's minds. He says the people got together and worked on the wall. Why? Because they had a heart, they had a mind to work. Their minds and their hearts were in it. And they ended up building this wall to half of its height. It's like the equivalent of the World War II slogan, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. You've heard this before? It's like we've got something in front of us. We've got work to do. We've got an enemy in front of us. There are a couple of pendulum swings that we need to be aware of when it comes to prayer and prudent action. I think the first pendulum swings one way in the direction of, let me pray about that. Sometimes this is like kind of a Christian easy way out. I'm going to pray about it, and then I'm never going to circle back around to it. Never do anything with it. We just kind of spin our wheels. I'm praying about it. I'm still praying about it. You're still praying about it? Yeah, I'm still praying about it. Wash the dishes, man. You don't need to pray about it. Just do it. That's the prudent action side. Others of us, we just go right to prudent action. And we don't submit. We may know what to do. Wisdom says do this thing, but we still don't take the time to submit. What we need is prayers who are doers and doers who are moving in the prayer side, and that's where the power is. That's where the synergy happens, prayer and prudent action. Nehemiah immediately turns to God for protection, and then he turns his and the people's hands to the work. Look at verses 7 through 9. I'll pick up the pace here. The success of Nehemiah and gang, as they see this wall built to half its height, it enrages their enemies even more. And so what we see is more prayer and more prudent action. We see more faith and we see more work. We're introduced to more opponents too. So we've got Sanballat in the north. We've got Tobiah in the east. Now we're introduced to the Ashdodites in the west and the Arabs in the south. What does this mean? North, right? North, south, east, west. What do we have? The people of God are surrounded. They're surrounded by their enemies. Remember, there's a big enemy behind all of this. All of these enemies, they come together against Jerusalem's progress in 446 to plot and to sow confusion. And they begin to escalate their opposition from this place of like verbal ridicule to outright sabotage and threats of violence. And it's on every side. What's the response? Nehemiah's response, it's prayer and prudent action. We prayed to our God and we set a guard as a protection against them day and night. We see bold faith, we see courageous action come together like thunder and like lightning. Real faith prays, you guys. Real faith also moves in trust and obedience, and in action and courage. Real faith takes action. Real faith keeps the mission of God central. Enemies and opponents, they can whine, they can cry, they can plot, they can sow division, and they can create factions. Fine. We will keep building because we trust that God will keep protecting and providing. Look at verses 10 through 14. The opponents and therefore God's enemy, Satan, they did have some success in disrupting all of this work. They got into the heads of some. Whispers and doubts quickly start circulating. Verse 10, you guys, the strength of those who are bearing these burdens, it's failing. There's too much rubble. The work is too big. By ourselves, we're not going to be able to rebuild this wall. We don't have the resources. We don't have the protection. We don't have the time. We don't have what we need. And so like lions on an injured animal, their mouths just wet and their appetites ready. Sanballat and Tobiah, they plot to ambush and, quote, kill the workers in Jerusalem and get their way. And so the verbal ridicule gives way to violent threats on their lives. And then it swirls even more. Remember, last week we saw in Nehemiah 3 that it was not just people who called Jerusalem home who were working on the wall, but people from all of the surrounding provinces nearby. There were people from the countryside that were coming in to help them with the effort. And there are well-meaning, I'm sure, family members who had other family members who were in the city, and they get wind that there are threats against Jerusalem and that this army of Samaria is plotting an attack. And so they call to their family members who are working in the city, and they actually function as agents of discouragement to those who have the courage to build and pray and give their lives for the sake of the people and the future of Jerusalem and the promises of God that will come through the city and the temple. Often our own brothers and sisters mean well, but can stand in the way of the work of God in our lives. And let's not be mistaken, we can also stand in the way of the call of God on other people's lives as well. You sure you should move your family to that country to start that church or to work for that nonprofit or to work for that agency? Are you sure that you should have those people living in your home? Are you sure you should foster those kids? Are you sure you should leave what you're doing and the security that you have and the job you have now to start that church or to start that family of churches? Are you sure you should be giving that much money? You could buy a boat. You could buy a truck. You could buy a bigger and better house. This is college education for your kids. Are you sure? Are you sure you should leave your job to pursue the calling of God on your life? Are you sure? Nehemiah didn't hold a meeting, and he didn't do the democratic kind of everybody gets a voice thing. Look at verse 13. The wall had been fully joined together, but there's still low places where an invading army could penetrate the city. And he writes, so in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in these open places where these breaches, essentially, where an enemy can come in, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords and their spears and their bows. And I looked and arose, and I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. Nehemiah is giving the Braveheart speech. Freedom! But it's not freedom. It's fight for your futures. It's fight for your families. It's fight for your well-being. It's fight for the promise of God to come through for you. Look at verses 15 through 23. Who had frustrated the work of God? The work of God's enemies, rather. Who had frustrated the work of God's enemies? God did it. The hand of their God had been upon them since the early days of talking with King Artaxerxes and requesting to go back into Jerusalem. And here he is under great duress and pressure and threat, and he is still protecting them. Nehemiah gives God the credit. That's intentional worship. We have prayer, and we have prudent action, and we have intentional worship all throughout Nehemiah chapter 4. And the people of God keep up the good work of God in their day. And so the threats and the vulnerabilities are still there, but the element of surprise had been taken away. God sort of popped the balloon of the surprise of this invading army. And so Nehemiah divides these laborers up, and it probably meant that the work of God slowed to some degree, but the mission of God was protected among them. Look at this. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah who were building on the wall, which means that the leaders went first. The people were unified. There's tons of instability. There's tons of turmoil and disorder, but God is there, present, directing, guiding, and the people are unified, and the people have everything and everyone that they need. Prudent action said the people needed to be ready at a moment's notice to do two things: to work on the wall and to be willing to fight, to defend, and to fight for their future. And so the people with the wheelbarrows, they have a sidearm. The guys who are the masons working on the wall, they've got their sword. They are ready. And there's contingency planning in here too, because Nehemiah says, hey, we are spread out, verse 20. Here's our crisis plan. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. And then look, there's more worship. Our God will fight for us. Our God will come through for us. But prudent action said, we're going to post lookouts on the walls above the city. And where we see the invading army come, we will come down on horseback, blow the trumpet. Everybody who is working and spread out on the wall will come to that place, and we will fight, and our God will fight for us. Nehemiah reminded his people who had their back. John Knox, a Scottish reformer, he endeavored to reach all of Scotland with the gospel. And he's famous for this sentence. He's famous for, God, give me Scotland or I die. He's leveraging everything he has for the call of God on his life. For his part, God had spoken to him, given him direction, and John Knox knew his fit. He knew his call in life. He's also famous for a saying, one man with God is always a majority. One man with God or woman with God is always a majority. Nehemiah knew this. Let the enemies mount an attack. We're going to meet them, and God is going to beat them. That's what's going to happen. Our God will fight for us. And so Nehemiah and the wall builders, they stay focused and they face head on the crisis in front of them. And they keep their combat boots on. And that's what the church does. You guys, we're not in a time of peace. We're in a time of war. Jesus has told us our call. He has given us our mission. It's to go to the nations and to make disciples and to baptize them into the name of the Father and into the name of the Son and into the name of the Holy Spirit, and to teach them all that I have taught you, to teach them to observe all that he has taught. And behold, he gives us this promise. He is always with us to the very end of the age. What else can this mean? But it's Jesus' promise that he is going to fight for the progress of his church. He will continue to give us success in our efforts to make disciples and to reach the nations, to reach the people across our streets, to reach the people in our workplaces and in our schools and in our neighborhoods. He will continually fight for us. The church keeps her boots on. This is not peacetime. This is wartime. Jesus also gave a promise. Peter, on your confession that I am the Christ, this is what I'm going to build my church on. And the gates of hell will not be able to defend against the advance of the church throughout the ages. And so, yes, it looks like culture is closing in on us. Yes, it looks like things are getting darker. Yes, for our church, we are struggling with instability and where will we go and where will we gather questions. But the reality is, in the dark times, in the pressing times, in the pressured times, that is when churches thrive. Our God fights for us. Our God fights for his people, his individuals, and his churches. Our God is fighting for us even now. He doesn't slumber. He doesn't sleep. He is not slow in providing for us. Even now, everything that he has done for us is enough. Everything that God has done for you and I in 2024 is enough. He's given us salvation. He's given us his Son. How will he not also give us all that we need? He's given us everything that we need for life and godliness. He's given us his word. He's brought us into a church. He's given us his Son. At confession that Jesus is Lord, we receive the Spirit of God who stays with us and seals us for the day of redemption. He's given us all that we need. Everything else is bonus. Everything else is bonus. Nehemiah shows us that when things are unstable, when things are challenging, when things are dangerous, there is a capital S someone behind the scenes who is defending us and looking out for us, even if there's an enemy behind the scenes who is opposing us. God fights for the good of his church and the glory of his name, and he gives his people wisdom and courage to join him in his work and to work with him on his mission.